December 7th, 1941, began like an ordinary Sunday morning in the Pacific. The waters of Pearl Harbor were calm, the sky over Hawaii bright and clear. Sailors aboard American battleships were preparing for routine duties, some still finishing breakfast, others writing letters home. Few of them could have imagined that within minutes the quiet harbor would become the center of one of the most devastating surprise attacks in modern history. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared out of the clouds. Dive bombers and torpedo planes descended toward the harbor with terrifying precision. Sirens began to scream across the naval base, but by the time the alarms sounded, the attack was already underway. Bombs exploded along Battleship Row. Torpedoes sliced through the water toward anchored ships that had little room to maneuver. Within moments, smoke and fire filled the air. Sailors scrambled to anti-aircraft guns. Some fired wildly into the sky, trying to track fast-moving enemy planes. Others struggled to free trapped crewmates as ships began to list and sink beneath them. The USS Arizona erupted in a massive explosion when a bomb ignited its ammunition magazine. The blast tore the battleship apart and sent a towering column of flame and smoke into the sky. Hundreds of sailors were killed instantly. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but the destruction was staggering. Battleships were crippled, aircraft destroyed, and more than 2,000 Americans were dead. Across the United States, shock quickly turned to anger. President Franklin Roosevelt would soon call the attack a date which will live in infamy. The United States had been thrust fully into the Second World War. But even as rescue crews worked through the burning wreckage at Pearl Harbor, military leaders were already asking a critical question. How had this happened? Japan had managed to launch a massive naval strike force across thousands of miles of ocean without being detected. 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and dozens of escort ships had moved into position in complete secrecy. Somehow, American intelligence had failed to see it coming. The reality was deeply troubling. The United States Navy knew that Japan relied heavily on encrypted radio communications to coordinate its fleets. Orders, movements, and strategic plans were transmitted across the Pacific in coded messages. If those messages could be read, American commanders might be able to predict Japanese operations before they happened. But there was a problem. The Japanese Navy used an extraordinarily complex encryption system known as JN-25. To American cryptanalysts, it appeared almost impenetrable. Messages were encoded using thousands of numerical code groups, each representing words, phrases, or instructions. Then those numbers were further disguised using an additional layer of encryption. Even if an analyst identified a code group, the meaning could still be hidden beneath another mathematical transformation. To anyone intercepting the signals, the messages looked like endless streams of random numbers. Yet somewhere inside those numbers were the plans of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For years before the war, American intelligence had been quietly listening to Japanese radio traffic. At remote listening stations across the Pacific, operators wearing headphones carefully copied down intercepted transmissions. They wrote rows of numbers onto sheets of paper, hour after hour, day after day. Most of those numbers meant nothing, but intelligence officers believed that if enough messages were collected, patterns would eventually appear. Repeated sequences might reveal important code groups. Fragments of meaning could be reconstructed piece by piece. It was a slow, exhausting process that demanded patience and extraordinary attention to detail. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, that quiet effort suddenly became one of the most important missions in the entire war. In a cramped basement at Pearl Harbor itself, a small team of codebreakers was already at work. The unit was known as Station HYPO.
Its leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was not the kind of officer who looked like a traditional naval hero. He often worked in a robe-bab and slippers, sleeping only a few hours at a time between long shifts analyzing intercepted messages. But Rochefort possessed something far more valuable than appearances. He had an extraordinary mind for patterns and language. More importantly, he understood that within the tangled numbers of JN-25 lay the key to Japan's future plans. His team faced a daunting challenge. Every intercepted message contained dozens of code groups, and each could represent hundreds of possible meanings. Worse still, the Japanese Navy regularly updated its encryption tables, replacing old values with new ones to prevent enemy codebreakers from catching up. Progress came painfully slowly. Analysts pinned scraps of paper across walls and bulletin boards. They compared thousands of intercepted transmissions, searching for repeated number sequences. Sometimes a small clue would emerge, a pattern suggesting a date, a location, or a ship designation. Even a single confirmed code group could unlock dozens of new possibilities in other messages. Day and night the team worked in the dimly lit basement rooms of Station HYPO. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the constant scratching of paper across paper. Some analysts worked 20-hour shifts, barely stopping to eat. Outside, the Pacific War was rapidly expanding. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces surged across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Hong Kong fell, the Philippines were under siege, Malaya and Singapore were collapsing. Japanese fleets moved from one target to the next, striking with coordination and speed that seemed almost unstoppable. To American commanders, the situation felt dangerously uncertain. Enemy forces appeared across vast distances with little warning. Aircraft carriers, now the most powerful weapons at sea, could launch devastating attacks far beyond the horizon. Without reliable intelligence, the United States Navy was fighting blind. That was why the work happening at Station HYPO mattered so much. Every intercepted message represented a potential clue. Somewhere in those encrypted numbers were the movements of fleets, the plans of admirals, the targets of future attacks. If the code could be broken, even partially, it might allow American commanders to anticipate the enemy's next move. But time was running out. Japanese naval communications continued to pour across the airwaves, thousands of messages each week, each one carefully encrypted, each one hiding critical information behind layers of mathematical disguise. For Rochefort and his team, the challenge seemed almost impossible, and yet they refused to give up, because if they failed, the next surprise attack might already be on its way across the Pacific.
The war in the Pacific was expanding faster than anyone in Washington had expected. Japanese forces were advancing across thousands of miles of ocean, striking with speed and coordination that left Allied commanders constantly reacting instead of planning. Battles were being fought across distant islands, jungles, and open sea, but one of the most important battlefields in the entire war was hidden far from public view, inside a quiet basement at Pearl Harbor. The men working there were not pilots or sailors. They did not command fleets or fire weapons. Their war was fought with pencils, paper, and an endless flood of intercepted radio signals. This small intelligence unit was known as Station HYPO. Officially, it was a U.S. Navy cryptographic center responsible for analyzing Japanese naval communications. In reality, it was one of the most important intelligence operations in the Pacific. Leading the team was Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. While many officers wore crisp uniforms and maintained strict military formality, Rochefort preferred practicality over appearance. During long shifts, he often worked in a bathrobe and slippers, surrounded by stacks of intercepted messages and handwritten notes.
He rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. But beneath that relaxed exterior was one of the sharpest analytical minds in American naval intelligence. Rochefort had spent years studying Japanese language and communications systems. Long before the war began, he understood that radio interception and code breaking would eventually become critical tools in naval warfare. Now, after Pearl Harbor, that belief had become reality. Station HYPO itself was far from glamorous. The cryptanalysis rooms were cramped and poorly ventilated. Desks were crowded together, papers covering nearly every surface. The walls were often filled with pinned notes, number sequences, and diagrams showing possible code relationships. The atmosphere was intense. The team knew that somewhere inside the thousands of intercepted messages they received each week were clues to Japan's future operations. Finding those clues required patience, logic, and relentless attention to detail. Every day, radio operators across the Pacific intercepted Japanese naval signals and transmitted them to intelligence centers. At Station HYPO, analysts would carefully copy these messages onto paper sheets filled with 5-digit number groups. To an ordinary observer, the pages looked meaningless, long rows of numbers stretched from one side of the page to the other. But to a trained cryptanalyst, even meaningless numbers could contain hidden patterns. The Japanese naval code system JN-25 was built around thousands of these 5-digit groups. Each group represented a specific word, location, ship name, or military instruction. However, the system was far more complicated than a simple codebook. After selecting a code group, Japanese operators applied an additional layer of encryption known as super-encipherment. This process altered the numbers using secret mathematical tables before transmission. As a result, even if American analysts suspected the meaning of a code group, the transmitted version could still appear completely different. Breaking JN-25 required solving 2 separate puzzles at the same time. Analysts needed to recover both the underlying codebook meanings and the mathematical values used to disguise them. It was slow and exhausting work. Many of the analysts at Station HYPO were young officers, mathematicians, linguists, or communications specialists. Some had backgrounds in engineering, others were experts in statistics or foreign languages. Each brought a different skill set to the task. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, one of Rochefort's most dedicated analysts. Dyer was known for his incredible endurance. During critical periods, he would work nearly around the clock, sometimes sleeping on a couch in the office before returning immediately to his desk. For the team, time seemed to blur together. Days and nights were measured not by clocks, but by the steady arrival of new intercepted messages. Some analysts specialized in identifying repeating number patterns. Others compared older messages with newly intercepted ones, hoping to recognize familiar code groups. Some worked with early mechanical tabulation equipment, including IBM punch card machines that helped sort large amounts of numerical data. These machines were primitive by modern standards, but they allowed analysts to process thousands of number combinations faster than manual sorting alone. Still, technology could only help so much. Most breakthroughs came from human intuition. A cryptanalyst might stare at a sequence of numbers for hours before suddenly noticing that one group appeared slightly more often than expected. Another analyst might realize that certain number patterns appeared only in messages sent from specific Japanese radio stations. Piece by piece, small fragments of meaning began to emerge. A particular code group might be identified as a reference to fuel supplies. Another might represent aircraft carriers. A third might correspond to a geographic location somewhere in the Pacific. Each confirmed discovery made it slightly easier to interpret other messages, but the progress was fragile.
The Japanese Navy frequently updated its encryption tables. When a new set of additive numbers was introduced, many of the partial solutions the Americans had built could suddenly become useless. Analysts would have to begin the process all over again, rebuilding their understanding from scattered clues. Despite these setbacks, Rochefort remained confident. He believed that with enough intercepted traffic, enough patience, and enough analytical effort, the code could eventually be broken. The Japanese Navy was transmitting too many messages to hide all its secrets forever. The challenge was not simply to read past communications. The real goal was to understand the present and predict the future. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese fleets were moving across the Pacific. Carriers were launching aircraft. Admirals were planning their next operations. If Station HYPO could learn where those fleets were going, the balance of the war might begin to shift. But for now, the answers remained buried inside endless rows of 5-digit numbers. And in the dim basement rooms of Pearl Harbor, the Codebreakers continued their quiet, relentless search for patterns that might change the course of the war. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific had entered a dangerous new phase. Japanese forces had captured vast territories with stunning speed, and their navy appeared nearly unstoppable. Their aircraft carriers had already demonstrated their power at Pearl Harbor, and now they were moving freely across the Pacific, striking wherever they chose. For the United States Navy, understanding Japan's next move had become a matter of survival. Inside the basement of Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort and his team were still fighting their silent battle against the Japanese naval code JN-25. Weeks of exhausting work had begun to produce small but important breakthroughs. Patterns were emerging. Certain number groups were beginning to reveal their meanings. Slowly, the fog surrounding Japanese communications was starting to thin. But the code was still far from fully broken. Each intercepted Japanese message contained dozens of 5-digit groups, and every group could represent a word, a ship, a location, or a military instruction. On top of that, the super-encipherment system continued to scramble the numbers before transmission. Even when analysts suspected they understood a code group, they still had to peel away the mathematical layer hiding it. The process often felt like assembling a giant puzzle with most of the pieces missing. Still, the analysts kept pushing forward. By comparing thousands of intercepted transmissions, Rochefort's team began to recognize recurring patterns in Japanese naval traffic. Some messages clearly involved fleet movements. Others discussed supply shipments, patrol routes, or reconnaissance flights. Gradually, certain code groups started appearing more frequently in messages connected to what looked like an upcoming operation. One mysterious designation kept showing up again and again: AF. The analysts knew that the Japanese often used abbreviated location codes for strategic targets. AF was clearly important, but no one was certain what place it represented. It appeared in messages discussing aircraft carriers, troop movements, and large naval forces. Whatever AF was, it was likely the next major objective. Rochefort believed identifying AF could reveal Japan's entire strategy. Some intelligence officers in Washington believed AF might refer to targets in the South Pacific, perhaps Fiji or Samoa. Others suspected locations in the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. But Rochefort's team had a different theory. They believed AF meant Midway. Midway Atoll was a tiny cluster of islands located roughly halfway between Hawaii and Japan. Despite its small size, it was strategically critical. The island contained an American airfield and served as a forward outpost protecting Hawaii. If Japan captured Midway, it could extend its defensive perimeter deep into the Pacific and threaten the American fleet directly. But believing something was not enough. Rochefort needed proof. Without solid evidence, naval commanders might dismiss the theory and prepare for an attack somewhere else.
So the team at Station HYPO decided to test their hypothesis. They devised a simple but clever plan. The American base at Midway would send an unencrypted radio message reporting that its water purification system had broken down and the island was running dangerously low on fresh water. The message would be transmitted openly, allowing Japanese intelligence operators to intercept it. If Midway really was the location known as AF, Japanese communications might soon mention that AF was experiencing a water shortage. The plan relied on a basic assumption that Japanese analysts would include the information in their encrypted reports. The message was sent. Then the team waited. Days passed as more intercepted Japanese signals arrived at Station HYPO. Analysts worked quickly, searching through the endless number groups for anything unusual. Every new message was examined for clues. Finally, the confirmation appeared. One intercepted Japanese message reported that AF is short of water. For Rochefort and his team, it was the moment they had been waiting for. AF was Midway. The puzzle pieces were suddenly falling into place. Further analysis of Japanese communications revealed more details about the operation. The messages suggested that a large Japanese fleet, including multiple aircraft carriers, was preparing to attack the island in early June 1942. The goal was clear. Japan intended to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. Once the U.S. fleet rushed to defend Midway, Japanese aircraft carriers would destroy it, eliminating the last major naval threat in the Pacific. If the plan succeeded, Japan could dominate the ocean for years. But now, thanks to the Codebreakers at Station HYPO, the United States Navy had something it had never had before. Warning. Rochefort's team continued working around the clock, extracting every possible detail from Japanese transmissions. They analyzed ship designations, estimated fleet movements, and pieced together the structure of the attack force. Gradually, a picture of the Japanese plan emerged. 4 major aircraft carriers would lead the strike on Midway. Additional forces would support the operation, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Another Japanese fleet would move north toward the Aleutian Islands in a diversionary attack meant to confuse American defenses. It was an enormous and carefully coordinated operation. But the most important detail was timing. The messages suggested that the main strike would occur in the first week of June 1942. Armed with this information, Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a critical decision. Instead of reacting to a surprise attack, he now had the opportunity to prepare an ambush. American carriers could be positioned northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. When the enemy fleet approached, U.S. dive bombers could strike first. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the United States Navy would not be fighting blindly. The silent work of a few exhausted cryptoanalysts in a basement had changed everything. What came next would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. And it would begin in the skies above a small Pacific island called Midway.
In the final days of May 1942, the Pacific Ocean became a vast chessboard. Far from the public eye, fleets were moving across thousands of miles of open water, each side unaware of exactly where the other might strike. The Japanese Navy believed it was about to spring a devastating trap. Instead, it was sailing directly into one. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz studied the intelligence reports coming from Station HYPO with intense focus. Joseph Rochefort and his team had done something extraordinary. They had not only identified Midway as the target of the next Japanese offensive, they had also estimated the size of the attacking force and the approximate date of the operation. For the first time in the war, American commanders had a clear picture of the enemy's intentions before the battle even began. Nimitz understood the stakes immediately.
If the Japanese plan succeeded, the remaining American aircraft carriers in the Pacific could be destroyed. Hawaii itself might be threatened. But if the United States could defeat Japan's carrier force, the balance of power in the Pacific might shift dramatically. The plan that followed was bold and risky. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, would move quietly toward a position northeast of Midway. There they would wait, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance planes, ready to strike when the enemy fleet approached the island. Yorktown's presence was especially remarkable. Just weeks earlier, the carrier had been heavily damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese intelligence believed the ship had been sunk or at least disabled for months. In reality, American repair crews at Pearl Harbor had worked around the clock, patching the carrier in an astonishing 72 hours so it could return to sea. Now Yorktown joined the other carriers, steaming toward the ambush point. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet advanced across the Pacific exactly as planned. At its core were 4 powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had launched the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor months earlier. These ships carried hundreds of experienced pilots and were considered the elite strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese commanders believed the element of surprise was still on their side. Their plan was carefully designed. Carrier aircraft would strike Midway first, destroying the American airfield and weakening its defenses. Then, when American carriers rushed in to respond, the Japanese fleet would locate and destroy them in a decisive battle. But there was one crucial detail the Japanese did not know. The American carriers were already waiting. Before dawn on June 4, 1942, Japanese aircraft lifted off from their carriers and headed toward Midway. Bombers and fighters roared across the sky toward the small island base, preparing to deliver the opening blow of the operation. Midway's defenders were ready. Radar operators detected the incoming strike force, and American fighters scrambled into the air. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire as the Japanese bombers approached the island. The air battle that followed was chaotic and brutal. Many American aircraft were shot down, but the island's airfield survived long enough to launch its own attacks against the approaching Japanese fleet. Wave after wave of American planes took off from Midway and headed toward the enemy carriers. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters attacked the fleet from different directions throughout the morning. Most of these early attacks failed. Many American aircraft were destroyed by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire before they could score hits. Torpedo squadrons flew straight into deadly defensive formations and suffered terrible losses. Some units lost nearly every plane. But these sacrifices had an unexpected effect. The repeated attacks forced the Japanese carriers to remain in constant defensive maneuvering. Fighters were launched to intercept incoming aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns fired continuously. On the carrier decks, crews rushed to prepare new strike planes, while others were being refueled and rearmed. The situation aboard the Japanese carriers became increasingly chaotic. Then, shortly after 10:20 in the morning, a small group of American dive bombers appeared high above the fleet. These aircraft came from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. By chance and careful navigation, they had approached the Japanese fleet at the exact moment when its defenses were stretched to their limit. Most Japanese fighter planes were flying at low altitude, chasing torpedo bombers that had just attacked. For a brief moment, the skies above the carriers were almost undefended. The American dive bombers rolled into their attack. From thousands of feet above the ocean, the planes plunged steeply toward their targets. Pilots aimed directly at the decks of the Japanese carriers below. Within minutes, everything changed. Bombs slammed into the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Explosions ripped through their hangar decks, where fueled aircraft and loaded bombs were being prepared for launch. Fire spread rapidly through the ships, igniting aviation fuel and ammunition. The damage was catastrophic. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were burning out of control. Smoke towers rose into the sky as crews desperately tried to contain the flames, but the fires spread too quickly. One by one, the ships were abandoned. Only the 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained operational. Later that afternoon, aircraft from Hiryu launched a counterattack that struck the American carrier Yorktown, damaging it severely. But American dive bombers soon located Hiryu as well. Another strike followed. Bombs hit the final Japanese carrier, setting it ablaze just like the others. By the end of the day, all 4 Japanese carriers that had once dominated the Pacific were sinking or burning beyond repair. The battle that Japan had expected to win had turned into a devastating defeat. More than 200 Japanese aircraft were lost, along with many of their most experienced pilots and crew members. The Imperial Navy had lost the core of its carrier strike force, a loss it would never fully recover from. For the American Navy, the victory at Midway marked a turning point. And it had all begun with a secret battle fought months earlier in a quiet basement where codebreakers had uncovered the enemy's plans hidden inside endless rows of numbers.
When the battle finally ended, the Pacific Ocean fell strangely quiet. The smoke that had once poured from burning ships slowly drifted away across the open water. Wreckage floated on the waves where some of the most powerful warships in the world had been destroyed only hours earlier. The Battle of Midway was over. For the United States Navy, the victory was almost unbelievable. In a single day of fighting, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been lost. These were not ordinary ships. They were the core of Japan's naval air power, the same carriers that had launched the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Now they were gone. Along with the ships, Japan had lost more than 200 aircraft and many of its most experienced pilots, mechanics, and flight crews. Training new pilots would take years. Replacing the carriers themselves would take even longer. The balance of power in the Pacific had suddenly shifted. Before Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy had dominated the ocean. Its carrier forces had moved freely across the Pacific, striking targets thousands of miles apart. American forces had mostly been reacting, struggling to defend scattered islands and naval bases. After Midway, the situation began to change. Japan was no longer able to launch large-scale offensive operations with the same confidence. Its navy had suffered a blow that it could not easily replace. From that moment forward, the war in the Pacific would slowly begin to move in the opposite direction. But very few people at the time understood the full story behind the victory. To the public, Midway was seen as a triumph of courage and skill by American pilots and sailors. Newspapers praised the dive bomber crews who had attacked the Japanese carriers. Admirals and commanders received recognition for their leadership during the battle. The role of the codebreakers remained hidden. Joseph Rochefort and the analysts at Station HYPO returned quietly to their desks. The war was far from over, and their work continued to be just as critical as before. Japanese forces were still active across the Pacific, and every intercepted message might contain clues about future operations. Secrecy was essential. If Japan discovered that its naval code had been partially broken, it would immediately replace the entire system. Years of difficult work could vanish overnight. For that reason, the intelligence success behind Midway remained classified.
Only a small number of senior officers even knew the full details. Rochefort's team continued their exhausting routine. Day after day, they analyzed intercepted communications, searching for patterns and meanings inside endless strings of numbers. Their work helped guide American naval operations throughout the rest of the war. Intelligence from code breaking supported campaigns across the Pacific, from the Solomon Islands to the Philippines. But recognition never came. In fact, Joseph Rochefort's career took an unexpected turn. Despite his critical role in the victory at Midway, internal disagreements within the Navy led to his reassignment away from code-breaking work. He was transferred to a less prominent position, far from the intelligence operations he had helped build. For decades, the true story remained largely unknown. The codebreakers who had helped change the course of the war rarely spoke about their work. Most of the documents describing the intelligence operations were locked away in classified archives. Even many historians were unaware of how crucial the cryptanalysts had been to the outcome of Midway. It was not until many years later that the secret finally began to emerge. As government records were gradually declassified, researchers started uncovering the hidden history of Station HYPO and the code-breaking efforts in the Pacific. The story that emerged revealed just how important those quiet analysts had been. They had not fired a single shot. They had not piloted aircraft into battle. Yet their work had allowed American commanders to anticipate one of the most important naval operations of the entire war. By reading the enemy's communications, they had transformed uncertainty into knowledge. And knowledge, in this case, had become a weapon. In 1986, more than 40 years after the end of World War II, Joseph Rochefort finally received formal recognition for his achievements and his critical role in breaking Japanese naval codes. It was a long overdue honor. Today, historians widely consider the intelligence breakthrough before the Battle of Midway to be one of the most important code-breaking successes in military history. It demonstrated how information, analysis, and persistence could shape the outcome of battles long before the first shot was fired. The victory at Midway did not end the war in the Pacific, but it changed its direction. And behind that turning point stood a small group of determined analysts working in a basement, staring at endless rows of numbers, refusing to believe that the enemy's secrets were impossible to uncover.